Hey, howdy, hello, my loves. This is Tanya, the tour guide, and this is another episode of New Orleans Secret Myths. Part 2 of Little Palermo, the Axman of New Orleans, blood, bread, and the resilience of Little Palermo. New Orleans, a city where music floats through the night air, where spirits linger in wrought iron shadows, and where history doesn't stay buried. Tonight, we step into a time where fear ruled the Crescent City. When families barred their doors, when men stayed awake through the night, gripping whatever weapon they had, because something was coming. They called him the Axman. Story is not just about a killer. It's about a people, a community, a resilience forged in blood, prejudice, and survival. This is the story of Little Palermo and the terror that stalked it. By August of 1918, New Orleans was paralyzed. The killer did not lurk in alleyways. He did not strike strangers in the street. He entered homes. He entered sanctuaries. He entered while families slept. And he used their own tools against them. Axes. Always axes. On the night of May 22nd, 1918, Joseph and Catherine Maggios lay asleep just behind their small grocery store. By morning, Joseph's skull was shattered. Catherine's throat slashed so deeply she drowned in her own blood. Their killer had broken in silently using a chisel, left the weapon behind, and vanished into the night. It didn't stop. Grocers, Italian grocers, families, sleeping families, doors chiseled open, axes used, weapons left behind. No robbery, no clear motive, just violence. The Italian community, already outsiders in the South, was terrified. Men stayed awake all night, shotguns in hand, eyes fixed on doors that suddenly felt too thin. Press reported panic. And New Orleans Superintendent of Police, Frank Mooney, said what many feared. This is no ordinary man. This is a murderous degenerate, a fiend who gloats over blood. To understand the fear, you must understand the people being hunted. By the late 1800s, Sicilians flooded into New Orleans. They came poor, they came desperate, and they came in waves. Over 80% of Italian immigrants here were Sicilian. They worked the sugar fields, endured brutal conditions, saved every cent, and then they rose. From laborers to peddlers to grocers. By 1920, half the grocery stores in New Orleans were Sicilian-owned. They were not seen as white. They were called Black Dago. They were lynched, mocked, feared, and blamed. In the French Quarter from Jackson Square to Esplanade, a neighborhood emerged, crowded, alive, Italian-speaking. They called it Little Palermo. June 6, Louis Bessemer, another grocer, another attack. His mistress, Anna Harriet Lowe, would not survive. Schneider, a pregnant woman, awakened, a dark figure, and axe raised. She lived, barely. Joseph Romano, another night, another blow, another death. Descriptions? Vague. A shadow, a man, sometimes one, sometimes two, always gone. And then, as if the fear itself had found a voice, the killer wrote to New Orleans, not to the police, not to the mayor, but to the newspaper that sat at the center of public terror, the Times-Picayune. And in that letter, the Axman stopped being merely a murderer in the night. He became something larger, something theatrical, something infernal. Listen now to the words that sent an already shaken city into full dread. Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether which surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and you foolish police call the Axman. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, smeared with blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to amuse me, not only myself, but His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it will be better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the Axman. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, but I feel sure the police will always dodge me, as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens and the worst, for I am in a close relationship with the angel of death. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time on next Tuesday night, I'm going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in neither regions that every person shall be spared whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then so much for the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of you people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse, hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact or realm of fancy. Signed, the Axman. On that Tuesday night, the city didn't sleep. Music poured from every corner. Bands played in homes. People huddled together, waiting, listening, surviving. March 9th, 1919, across the Mississippi, Gretna. Charlie, Rosie, their 2-year-old daughter, Mary. Mary was killed instantly. Rosie survived barely. Authorities ignored the Axman theory. Instead, they blamed the neighbors. Orlando Giordano, his son Frank. No evidence, no witness, only pressure. Rosie was coerced, threatened, imprisoned until she signed a lie. Verdict, Frank, death. Orlando, life. Justice was not served. 9 months later, Rosie walked into the newspaper office. She said, a saint came to her in a dream and told her to tell the truth. She recanted everything. Even then, authorities resisted, threatened her with perjury, but eventually, in December 1920, the Giordano's walked free. Who was the Axman? The theories? Vendetta? Black Hand? Mafia? Detective John Donatantino disagreed. He said, this was no organized crime. This was something else. A killer who entered silently, used tools on site, left survivors, returned unpredictably. What we now call a serial killer. October 27th, 1919, the Axman claimed what many believe was his final victim in New Orleans, Mike Pepitone, a grocer, a husband, a man who never saw his killer's face. His wife, Esther Pepitone, saw the aftermath, blood, chaos, a life torn apart. After the murder, Esther did what many victims' families do. She left. She left the city, the memories, the fear. She traveled west to California. But what she carried with her was not grief alone. It was something else, something unresolved, something burning. 2 years later, 1921, in Los Angeles, the Axman story resurfaced, not through murder, but through vengeance. A man named Joseph Mumfrey and Esther Pepitone saw him. Esther shot him point blank, unalived him, and when no authorities asked why, her answer was chilling. She claimed he confessed that he was the man who murdered her husband, that he was the Axman. It was the closest thing to an answer anyone ever get. A widow, a gun, a confession. But there was a problem. Joseph Mumfrey was never formally linked to the Axman murders. No evidence, no corroboration, no investigation trying him to New Orleans. No confirmation that he had ever been there. So what happened? Was this a widow delivering justice? A desperate woman clinging to closure? Or a tragic misidentification born from grief? Did Mumfrey truly confess? Or did Esther hear what she needed to hear? 2 deaths, miles apart, connected by one claim, but never proven. And so the Axman case remained open. But this story cannot remain only a murder story, because the people the Axman hunted were not just victims in police reports. They were part of one of the great immigrant transformations in New Orleans history. These families were often poor when they arrived, but they were disciplined, entrepreneurial, and deeply communal. They rose before daylight, worked the river, worked the market, worked the ovens, worked the counters, and slowly turned survival into stability. While the Axman terrorized grocers and their households, Sicilian New Orleans was also building some of the institutions that would outlive fear itself. Bakeries, altars, music halls, sandwich shops, and family-run landmarks that still define the city. So in this story, the axe is only half the truth. The other half is bread, faith, music, and endurance. If you want to understand Sicilian resilience in New Orleans, step away from the blood for a moment and walk into an ice cream parlor. Walk into Angelo Brocato's. Founded in 1905, Angelo Brocato's began when Sicilian immigrant came to New Orleans after learning his craft in Palermo. He first opened on Ursuline Street in the French Quarter, serving a growing Sicilian community that still spoke the language of home and longed for the flavors of home. This was not just dessert. This was continuity. A man crosses an ocean, enters a city that does not fully trust him, and what does he do? He makes sweetness. He builds memory in sugar and cream. Ricardo introduced New Orleanians to Sicilian-style treats that became local staples: gelato, lemon ice, pastries, that elegant blend of vanilla, cinnamon, and almond. The shop survived because it was more than a business. It was a neighborhood anchor, a gathering place, a way for an immigrant family to plant itself in the life of the city. After Angelo died in 1946, his family carried the business forward, and in 1979, the shop moved from the old quarter location to the North Carrollton Avenue in Mid-City, where it still carries that old world feeling: marble counters, glass cases, ritual, repetition, and devotion. And then there is a St. Joseph altar at Ricardo's, so beloved that by the 1960s, it was hosted for 3 days, becoming one of the city's most famous expressions of Sicilian Catholic gratitude and public hospitality. The Axman letter promised hell. Ricardo answered history another way, with lemon ice, almond cream, family labor, and endurance. Before there was a muffaletta sandwich famous across America, there had to be bakers. And Little Palermo, the bakers mattered. The Historic New Orleans collection notes that one of the earliest documented Italian bread bakeries in the city was F. Lombardo and Son Bakery, connected to Agostino Lombardo, a Sicilian baker listed on St. Philip Street in 1891 city directory before the family moved operations to 1210 Decatur Street near the French Market. From there, Sicilian bakery families multiplied across the quarter and beyond, creating a bread tradition that shaped New Orleans for generations. Among those families were the Ruffinos. Southern Foodway records that Giuseppe Rufino came to New Orleans from Sicily and opened Rufino's Bakery on St. Philip Street, where he baked bread for fellow Sicilians in the old neighborhood. That bakery became part of a long continuum of family bread making that linked Rufino, Evola, Logidis, and other Sicilian bakery names across the 20th century. They were not decorative businesses. They fed laborers, they supplied groceries, they anchored festivals and altars, and they preserved edible identity. The loaves themselves told the story: sesame bread, braided loaves, St. Joseph's bread, scafoni, and the broad, round loaf that would become inseparable from one of the New Orleans' most famous sandwiches. The bakery ovens of Sicilian New Orleans did not just produce food, they produced belonging. And then we come to one of the most famous names in all of New Orleans food history, Central Grocery. Founded in 1906 on Decatur Street by Sicilian immigrant Salvador Lupo, Central Grocery stood in the heart of the French Quarter, serving Sicilian workers, market men, and families in Little Palermo. The store still identifies itself as the home of the original Muffaletta. The genius of the Muffaletta was not elegance, it was utility. The story most often told is that Sicilian laborers and market workers used to buy cold cuts, cheese, olives, and bread separately. Lupo's contribution was to put it all together in a single, practical, abundant sandwich, layered with Italian meats and cheeses, and bound together by that unmistakable olive salad on a sesame-seeded rounded loaf. In that sense, the muffaletta was not only delicious, it was efficient immigrant food built for people who worked with their hands and ate when they could. The sandwich itself bears the mark of a Sicilian bread culture. The loaf matters. The sesame matters. The structure matters. Without the bakery tradition around it, there is no canonical muffaletta. The sandwich was as much a product of Little Palermo's bread ovens as it was of Central Grocery's counter. Central Grocery became a multi-generational institution and after severe damage from Hurricane Ida in 2021, it reopened in December 2024. Following major restoration, that reopening matters in this story because it shows the same pattern again and again in Sicilian New Orleans: hardship, damage, rebuilding, return. The city tried to frighten Little Palermo. History tried to erase it. Storms tried to break it. And still, on Decatur Street, the doors opened again. To understand Sicilian New Orleans, you must understand that its faith was not abstract. It was edible, architectural, communal. The tradition of St. Joseph's Day altars came from Sicily, where, according to long-held devotion, people prayed to St. Joseph during a severe famine and vowed a feast of thanksgiving if relief came. When Sicilian immigrants settled in New Orleans in the late 19th century, they brought that vow with them. By the late 1800s, the altar tradition had taken root here, especially among families in Little Palermo. The altar is usually built in 3 tiers, representing the Holy Trinity. Because St. Joseph's feast day falls during Lent, the food is traditionally meatless. Breads are shaped into crosses, staves, flowers, and carpenter tools in honor of Joseph. Pastries and cookies rise above candles, statues, citrus, greenery, and holy cards. And somewhere among the offerings, almost always, is the fava bean. Remembered as the crop that survived famine and became a symbol that hunger had been broken. But the altar is not only about display, it's about distribution. After the blessing and the ritual breaking of the altar, food is traditionally shared with visitors and donated onward, especially to the poor. In New Orleans, the custom expanded beyond private homes into churches, schools, restaurants, and public community spaces. The altar became a way of saying, we survived scarcity, so now we feed others. There were also local customs: children reenacting a search for shelter, visitors receiving lucky fava beans, the wearing of red, the bread saved for protection, the open invitation to strangers. In other words, the altar is not just religion. It is memory staged as hospitality. And that matters in an Axman story, because while one force entered homes to destroy families in their sleep, another tradition opened homes to feed the city. Famous night when the Axman warned New Orleans to play jazz or risk the axe. The threat lands differently when you remember who was helping shape jazz in the first place. Sicilian New Orleans was not outside the music story. It was inside it. By the early 20th century, Sicilian and Italian families lived close proximity to Creole and Black communities in and around the French Quarter and nearby neighborhoods. In that crowded world of parades, brass bands, opera melodies, church music, street performance, and dance rhythm, styles collided and cross-pollinated. The result was one of the richest musical ecosystems in American history. One of the most famous Sicilian American names in early jazz is Nick LaRocca, the New Orleans-born cornetist associated with the original Dixieland Jazz Band, whose 1917 recording is widely recognized as the first jazz record to reach a national audience. That recording did not invent jazz. Black musicians in New Orleans had already created the form, but it helped propel the sound into the national marketplace. And then there is Louis Prima, born in New Orleans to Sicilian parents, who carried that hybrid energy into swing. Prima's trumpet, humor, physicality, and showmanship made him one of the greatest entertainers of the swing era. But beneath the charisma was a musician deeply shaped by New Orleans and by the Sicilian American world that raised him. The New Orleans Jazz Museum specifically points to his Sicilian New Orleans roots as central to his story. So when we talk about Sicilian jazz, we're not claiming ownership over a Black art form born from African-American genius, struggle, and innovation. What we are talking about is contact, the immigrant brass players, neighborhood proximity, shared streets, shared labor, shared listening, and the way New Orleans turned many traditions into one unmistakable sound. From jazz, the line keeps moving to dance bands, into swing, to rhythm and blues, into rock and roll, which brings us to another Sicilian New Orleans name that helped change American music forever. Cosimo Matassa and the early Sicilian New Orleans helped shape the city street sound. Cosimo helped preserve it in wires, tapes, shellac, and vinyl. Born in New Orleans in 1926, Matassa opened J&M Recording Studio in the back of his family's appliance and music shop on North Rampart Street. The room was small, modest, almost improbable, but from that little room came an astonishing amount of recorded history. This is where the New Orleans sound was captured and amplified. Matassa recorded artists including Fats Domino, Little Richard, Ray Charles, Guitar Slim, Roy Brown, Professor Longhair, Aaron Neville, and many more. His studio became one of the crucial birthplaces of post-war rhythm and blues and early rock and roll. The Louisiana Music Hall of Fame and Rock and Roll Hall of Fame both recognize his importance, and the Historic New Orleans Collection notes that in 1956, he moved to a larger studio at Governor Nichols Street, renaming it Cosimo Recording Studio. One of the landmark sessions came on December 10th, 1949, when Fats Domino and Dave Bartholomew recorded The Fat Man at J&M, a record often named among the earliest rock and roll contenders. What made Matassa special was not flashy celebrity. It was ear, discipline, and place. He knew how New Orleans records should feel. Heavy rhythm section, driving piano, vocal forward, groove first. He recorded the city in a way that let the city remain itself. By the late 1940s through the early 1970s, an enormous share of New Orleans R&B hits passed through one of his studios. So in this story of Sicilian resilience, Matassa matters because he represents a later generation of ascent, from immigrant family roots in the quarter to a technical command post that helped shape American popular music. The grocers fed the city. The bakers shaped it. The musicians animated it, and Matassa recorded its pulse. And then there's the other side of Sicilian story in New Orleans. Not the cramped grocery behind a family bedroom, not the bakery heat, not the laborer's cart, but triumph on Royal Street. Hotel Monteleone began in 1886 when Antonio Monteleone, a Sicilian immigrant who had first found success as a cobbler, purchased a small hotel in the French Quarter. From that modest beginning, the Monteleone family expanded and rebuilt over generations until the property became one of the greatest historic hotels of New Orleans. Still family-owned nearly a century and a half later, it is a story of an immigrant success story in brick and hospitality. A Sicilian newcomer enters an often suspicious city, and instead of remaining at the margins, his family creates one of its great landmarks. Hotel Monteleone is not only known for luxury, it is also one of the city's great literary sites. The hotel's own history notes that it appears in the works of writers including Eudora Welty, Anne Rice, William Faulkner, Truman Capote, and Tennessee Williams, and it was designated a National Literary Landmark in 1999. Other literary histories tie the hotel to frequent visits or stays by Faulkner, Williams, Hemingway, and Capote. And then there is the Carousel Bar. Installed in 1949, rotating slowly through the decades as if New Orleans itself refused to stand still. The hotel became both a family monument and a public stage, an elegant expression of what Sicilian endurance could become in this city. So when people speak of Sicilians in New Orleans only through the language of vendetta, blackhand fear, or immigrant suspicion, they miss the full picture. Because Sicilian New Orleans also builds hotels and bakeries and dessert parlors and groceries and altars and sandwiches and swing and the recorded soundtrack of modern America. The Axman wanted New Orleans to remember fear, but history remembered something else too. It remembered the Sicilian families who kept going, the bakers of St. Philip and Decatur, the altar builders of March, the groceries who rose before dawn, the Broccatos with their sweets, the Lupos with their Muffelettas, the Monteleons on Royal Street, the brass, the swing, the singers, the studio men, the record cutters, the keepers of ritual and flavor and sound. The Axman disappeared. Little Palermo did not. Its people endured long enough to become inseparable from New Orleans itself. Thank you all for listening to part 2 of Little Palermo. I hope you enjoyed listening as much as I loved creating it. I would also, again, like to thank my editor, Isaiah the artist, in helping me to turn this into something productive. Till next week, thank you for joining me at New Orleans Secretness. This is Tanya, the tour guide, signing off.